The wind had a way of carrying voices across the plains, bending them so that sometimes you couldn't tell if they came from behind you or far ahead. That morning, it carried two small voices, thin, pleading, desperate. "Please don't leave us." The words hit like a bullet he wasn't expecting. Jedediah Cole had his boot in the stirrup, one hand on the worn leather saddle horn. When he heard it, he froze, shoulders tight, head turning slowly toward the sound. Two children stood in the pale light of dawn, framed against the endless prairie. Twins, a boy and a girl, no older than 8, dust on their faces, their clothes ragged and thin. Their eyes, God help him, looked just like the eyes of every lost soul he'd buried or left behind in this land that didn't forgive weakness. He didn't answer. Not yet, just looked at them, jaw working beneath the stubble that covered his face. The prairie wind gusted again, rattling dry sage and carrying the creak of an old windmill somewhere behind the barn. It smelled of dust and horse sweat and the faint copper tang of the iron pump that hadn't worked right in weeks. Jedediah had been heading out to move cattle before the heat set in. It was supposed to be a quiet day. But now he was staring at two orphans who had no business being this far from town, barefoot and hollow-cheeked, their small hands clutching each other like if one let go, the other might blow away. He swallowed hard, the old ache in his chest tightening. But let's go back to where it all started. Jedediah Cole wasn't a man who asked for trouble, and he wasn't one who offered much comfort either. Folks in town called him a widower, a recluse, sometimes worse. His spread sat 10 miles south of Red Bluff, a lonely patch of cattle land where the sky seemed too big and the silence too heavy for most men to stand. He'd been a soldier once, back when Texas soil ran red and neighbors killed each other over flags and pride. Those days left him with scars, some on his body, more on his soul. He buried his wife in a small patch of earth behind the house 6 years back. After that, the world just got quieter for him. Cattle didn't ask questions. The prairie didn't demand answers. He liked it that way. That was until the twins showed up. It started 2 nights ago, when the sound of coyotes yipping close to the barn drew him from bed with a rifle in hand. The moon was a pale sliver, barely lighting the yard as he stepped off the porch boards that groaned beneath his boots. That's when he saw them, 2 small figures crouched by the fence, shivering under a ragged quilt that looked like it had been pulled from a wagon fire. "Hey!" he barked, raising the lantern high. They'd stared at him like deer about to bolt. Big eyes, silent, too afraid to speak. "Where are your folks?" he asked, voice rough. They didn't answer. The boy gripped his sister's hand tighter. Jedediah had half a mind to chase them off. He wasn't in the business of feeding strays, human or otherwise. But something in their faces stopped him. Maybe it was the way the girl's lips trembled like she'd forgotten how to be warm. So he'd let them in, gave them each a cup of water and some cornbread that was going stale. Told them they could sleep in the hayloft just for the night. He figured they'd be gone by morning. But they weren't. And now, standing with one boot in the stirrup, the sun creeping higher over the flat horizon, Jedediah heard those words. The words he hadn't been ready for. "Please don't leave us." The boy's voice cracked, rough with thirst and fear. Jedediah let his boots slip from the stirrup. He turned fully to face them. Dust swirled around his boots, the wind cutting through the quiet morning like a warning. He studied them the way a man studies a choice he doesn't want to make. The boy's shirt hung off him like it had belonged to someone bigger. The girl had a gash on her knee, half-healed, streaked with dirt. Neither of them had shoes. They were the kind of kids who wouldn't last 2 days out here alone. Still, he said nothing. His horse, an old buckskin mare named Clementine, flicked her ears and stamped a hoof impatiently. Jedediah looked at the land stretching in every direction. This wasn't a place for children. He knew it. They knew it. Everyone who ever buried someone out here knew it. The girl took a step forward, her small voice barely a whisper. "Don't leave us." There was something in the way she said it, like she'd already seen too many backs turned on her. Jedediah exhaled slowly, his hand dropping from the saddle horn. The smart thing would be to ride to town, drop them off with the sheriff, let someone else deal with it. But when he looked at them, at the way the boy squared his tiny shoulders like he was trying to be the man, and the way the girl's chin trembled as she tried not to cry, Jedediah felt that old ache in his chest again. The kind that reminded him of graves too shallow, promises too easily broken. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed, harsh and lonely. He didn't move toward them, didn't say he'd help. Not yet, but something had shifted. The twins stood there, waiting, as if they knew this moment, this exact second, would decide the rest of their lives. And Jedediah Cole, the man who had spent 6 years with no one but cattle for company, realized for the first time in years that maybe he wasn't as alone as he thought. The silence stretched, and far off, carried by the wind, came another sound. Hoofbeats, slow, measured, getting closer. Jedediah's eyes narrowed toward the horizon. Trouble was coming, and this time it wasn't just his own neck on the line. Jedediah didn't sleep that night. After he heard those hoofbeats in the distance, he led the twins back into the barn, telling them in that low, steady voice of his to stay put and keep quiet. They obeyed without question, their wide eyes following him like he was the only solid thing left in their world. When dawn came again, the sound of riders hadn't returned, but Jedediah knew better than to believe it was over. Out here, nothing ever was. By noon, word had reached his land. He heard it from Amos Thatcher, a wiry neighbor with a nose for trouble who rode up to the fence line on a skittish paint mare. "You hear about the wagon?" Amos asked, reins slack in his hands, eyes darting toward the barn. Jedediah leaned on the fence post, jaw tight. "What wagon?" "Stage was hit 3 nights back. Couple settlers headed west, maybe more. Folks say everyone got themselves killed, but the outlaws left 2 kids wandering out there." Amos tipped his chin toward the barn door like he already knew what Jedediah was hiding. Jedediah didn't answer. Amos spat in the dust. "Word is, the sheriff don't want trouble with the Clemens gang. Says anyone sheltering survivors'll be bringing heat down on the whole town." Jedediah stayed silent, eyes steady, but inside he felt the ground shifting under him. Amos's voice dropped lower. "You best think long and hard about what you're doing, Jed. You ain't got family. You ain't got friends neither. Townfolk won't thank you for harboring a pair of kids the Clemens boys want dead." With that, Amos turned his mare and rode off, his warning hanging heavy in the dry air. Jedediah didn't move for a long time. He just stood there, the fence rail rough beneath his calloused hands, staring at the barn like it held the answer to a question he didn't want to ask. When he finally stepped inside, the twins were crouched by the hay bales, whispering to each other. They looked up at him like they weren't sure if he'd come back. The boy spoke first, voice barely above a breath. "Are you gonna send us away?" Jedediah didn't reply. The girl gripped her brother's hand tighter, eyes wide, shining with the tears she wouldn't let fall. He crouched down so he wasn't towering over them. "What's your names?" The boy hesitated. "Eli," he said finally, pointing to himself, then to his sister. "This is Clara." Jedediah studied them. The girl had a cut on her cheek he hadn't noticed before, like she'd been slapped. The boy's lip was split, half-healed. "How long you been on your own?" Eli shrugged. "Since the wagon." The words landed heavy. Jedediah stood, pulling off his hat and rubbing a hand through his unkempt hair. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to ride them to Red Bluff right now, hand them to the sheriff, wash his hands of it all. But when he imagined their faces as he left them behind, something in his chest hardened. Later that day, Jedediah hitched up the buckboard. "Where we goin'?" Eli asked, voice cautious. Jedediah didn't answer. He just helped them up into the seat, the leather reins creaking in his hands as he steered toward town. Red Bluff wasn't much to look at. One dusty street, a row of false front buildings, a saloon with squeaky doors, and a church bell that hadn't rung in months. Folks turned to stare when Jedediah rode in with the twins. He could feel the weight of their eyes, the mutters under breath. Mrs. Daughtry, the storekeeper's wife, stepped out onto the boardwalk, hands on her hips. "Jed Cole, you best not be thinking you can just parade those orphans through town like they're yours. Sheriff already said anyone messin' in Clemens' business'll answer for it." Jedediah didn't stop, didn't answer. He rode straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Harlan Briggs sat behind a worn desk, boots on the table, hat pulled low. He looked up slow, eyes narrowing when he saw the twins. "You can't leave him here," Briggs said flatly, before Jedediah had even spoken. "Got orders from up north. No one's talking sides against Clemens. Those kids are a death sentence to anyone keeps them." Jedediah stood there, hat in hand, jaw clenched. "They're just children." Briggs leaned back. "That ain't the point. You bring trouble on yourself, you bring it on the whole town. Best thing you can do is leave 'em out on the trail. Clemens'll take what they came for and leave the rest of us be." The twins stiffened beside Jedediah. Clara reached for his hand, her small fingers curling around his like she was hanging on to the last thing in the world that felt safe. Jedediah looked down at her, then back at Briggs, and in that quiet moment, a decision settled over him like a storm cloud building on the horizon. "No," he said. Briggs's eyes narrowed. "What did you say?" Jedediah set his hat back on his head, voice steady. "They're mine now." The twins looked up at him, confusion flickering across their faces, followed by something deeper. "Hope, you can tell Clemens," Jedediah said, turning for the door, "that if he wants him, he'll have to come through me." The room went still. Eli's small hand tightened around his sister's, and as Jedediah led them back out into the blinding sun, he knew there was no turning back. The prairie felt different that night, too quiet, too still. Jedediah sat on the porch with his rifle propped against his knee, eyes scanning the horizon where the last light of day bled out behind the hills. The twins were inside, curled up under quilts he hadn't touched since before his wife passed. Every now and then, he could hear Clara's soft cough or Eli's restless shifting in the old bed frame. He'd spent the whole day repairing fences, checking the herd, moving like a man preparing for something he couldn't yet see. Word had spread fast after what he told Sheriff Briggs. By evening, Amos Thatcher had ridden by again, stopping just long enough to shake his head. "You're making a mistake, Jed. Clemens ain't just a man. He's got 20 guns riding with him, and a dozen more who'll do what he says for free. You stand against him, you stand alone." Jedediah hadn't answered then, and he didn't now. He just sat there, listening to the wind scrape dry grass across the dirt yard. Then, faint at first, came a sound that made his stomach knot. Hoofbeats, slow, deliberate. He rose, rifle in hand, stepping down from the porch boards that creaked under his boots. From the dark horizon, shapes emerged, riders, 5 at first, then more behind them. The moonlight caught the steel of rifles, the glint of spurs. At their head rode Abel Clemens. Even in the dim light, Jedediah knew him. A broad-shouldered man with a wolfish grin and cold eyes. The kind who killed because he liked it, not because he had to. "Well, if it ain't the ghost of Jed Cole," Abel drawled as he reined in his horse a few yards away. "Heard you been playing daddy to some strays that ain't yours." Jedediah didn't move, didn't speak. "You know how this works, Cole?" Abel went on, leaning forward in the saddle. "You hand over what's mine, we ride outta here. You don't." He glanced at the barn, then back at Jedediah. "Well, we make sure no one ever remembers this place." Inside the house, Eli's small hand pulled Clara back from the window where she'd been peeking through the curtain. Jedediah tightened his grip on the rifle, jaw hard. "They're not yours." Abel's grin widened. "Boy, everything on this side of the Pecos is mine if I want it bad enough." One of his riders chuckled low, fingering the butt of his pistol. The air was so still that even the horses seemed to sense it, shifting uneasily, ears twitching, nostrils flaring at the tension that hung like storm clouds. "You're outnumbered, Cole," Abel said, voice almost amused. "Ain't no lawman comin' to save you. Town don't care. They want you dead as much as I do." Jedediah didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked to the window just once, to the tiny faces watching from inside. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady. "You take one step toward this house," he said, "and I swear, Abel, you won't be the one riding away tonight." The riders shifted, glancing between their leader and the lone rancher. Abel laughed. Big words for a man with one gun. Jedediah didn't move. The silence stretched. Then came the faint sound of more hoofbeats. Abel's grin faltered just slightly as the new riders appeared at the ridge, a half-dozen townsfolk on horseback, rifles across their laps. Amos Thatcher at their lead. "You ain't as alone as you think, Clemens?" Amos called out, voice carrying clear in the night air. Abel's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking between Jedediah and the men behind him. For the first time, Jedediah felt the balance shift. Just enough to matter. But Clemens wasn't done. Not yet. He leaned forward in the saddle, his voice dropping low. "You just bought yourself a war, Cole. You and them brats. And I'm a man who don't lose." Then he turned his horse sharply, spurring it into a gallop, his men following in a thunder of hooves and dust. Jedediah stood there, rifle in hand, watching them vanish into the dark. He knew they'd be back. And when they came, it wouldn't just be 5 riders, it would be all of them. Behind him, the twins stepped out onto the porch, their faces pale but their eyes steady. "You don't have to stay," Eli said quietly. Jedediah looked at him, then at Clara, who clung to her brother's sleeve. "I already told you," Jedediah said, voice rough but certain. "You're mine now." The words hung in the air, stronger than any rifle shot, stronger than any threat Abel Clemens could bring. But deep inside, Jedediah knew the real fight hadn't even begun. The next day dawned heavy with heat, the kind that made the horizon shimmer and the cattle move slow. But it wasn't the weather that weighed on Jedediah as he worked the pasture fence. It was the certainty that Abel Clemens would return, and this time, no posse from town would be enough to scare him off. Inside the house, Clara sat at the small table with her hands folded neatly, her dark hair falling across her face as she studied a tin plate Jedediah had scrubbed clean for her. Eli was in the yard, trying to mimic Jedediah's steady hands as he tied new wire to the fence posts. The boy worked in silence, jaw tight with focus, like he was trying to prove something to himself. "You don't have to do all that," Jedediah said quietly as he passed. Eli didn't look up. "If we're staying, I ought to help." Something in those words, simple, unshaken, lodged deep in Jedediah's chest. By evening, the sky burned orange, and Jedediah gathered them both by the porch steps. "Tomorrow," he said slowly, "we're riding into town again. There's papers needs signin'." Clara tilted her head. "What kind of papers?" "The kind that'll make you mine. For good." Eli's eyes widened, unsure if he'd heard right. Jedediah looked at them both, voice steady. "Ain't no sheriff, no outlaw, no man alive gonna take you from me once that's done. You'll be Cole, same as me." For the first time since they'd arrived, Clara smiled. A small, trembling thing that felt almost like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The next morning, Jedediah hitched the wagon again, the leather reins worn smooth from years of use. As they rode toward Red Bluff, folks stepped out onto boardwalks, watching them pass. Some nodded, some looked away, but none spoke. Inside the sheriff's office, Jedediah placed a hand on each of the twins' shoulders. "These here are Eli and Clara Cole," he said, voice like iron. Sheriff Briggs frowned, leaning back in his chair. "You sure about this, Jed? Clemens ain't gonna take kindly to it. This ain't just a kindness. You're invid in blood." Jedediah met his eyes, unflinching. "Better mine than theirs." The papers were signed in silence. Jedediah scrawled his name in the shaky handwriting of a man who hadn't signed much of anything in years. Then Eli and Clara, each gripping the pen with small fingers, wrote out their new last name, awkwardly, carefully, as if carving it into the world itself. When they stepped back into the sunlight, Clara slipped her hand into Jedediah's. "Does this mean we're really yours?" she asked softly. Jedediah looked down at her, the lines around his eyes deepening just slightly as something unspoken passed over his face. "It means," he said quietly, "that no matter what comes, you got someone who'll fight for you." But as they climbed into the wagon, a rider appeared at the far end of the street. Dust rose behind him as he galloped hard into town. Jedediah's gut tightened the moment he saw the red bandana tied around the man's neck. Clemens's colors. The rider didn't stop until he was right in front of them, his horse snorting, foam flecking its bit. "Clemens says you got till sundown," the man spat. Either hand over the brats, or we burn you out." He wheeled his horse around and rode off without another word. The twins stared at Jedediah, their hands tightening in his shirt sleeve. Jedediah looked down at them, then back toward the horizon where dust still hung in the air. "Go on inside," he said quietly. "Why?" Eli asked. "Because I've got work to do." The boy hesitated. You ain't leaving us?" Jedediah knelt, resting a calloused hand on each of their shoulders. "I told you before," he said, his voice like gravel but steady as bedrock. "You're mine now, and I don't run." That night, as the sky went black and the crickets started their song, Jedediah stood at the edge of his land, rifle across his back, a lantern burning faintly at his feet. He wasn't just waiting for Abel Clemens anymore. He was daring him to come. Inside the house, Eli and Clara huddled close together, their faces pale in the dim glow of the oil lamp. They didn't speak. But for the first time since that awful night on the wagon trail, they believed, truly believed, they weren't alone anymore. The night split open with gunfire. It started as a single crack in the distance, then another closer this time. Hoofbeats thundered against the hard-packed dirt, rattling the windows. Inside, Clara gasped, clutching Eli's arm so tightly her small fingers turned white. Jedediah stepped out onto the porch, rifle steady in his hands. The lantern on the rail cast long shadows across the yard, glinting off the barrel as he raised it to his shoulder. Abel Clemens rode in first, teeth bared in something between a grin and a snarl. Behind him, a dozen riders fanned out, their rifles catching the faint moonlight. "Last chance, Cole," Abel shouted, his voice carrying over the pounding hooves. "Hand him over, and maybe we'll let you live." Jedediah didn't answer. He took a slow breath, sighted down the barrel, and fired. The first rider went down hard, his horse rearing and bolting into the dark. Chaos erupted, shouts, gunfire, horses screaming as the outlaws scattered and regrouped. Jedediah moved like a man who'd been here before, calm and deliberate, each shot finding its mark. But there were too many of them, and every time one went down, two more seemed to take his place. Inside, Eli grabbed Clara's hand, pulling her toward the back door. "We gotta get out." But Clara dug her heels in, shaking her head. "No," he said, "not to run." The boy looked at her, fear and faith warring in his eyes. Finally, he nodded. Outside, Abel dismounted, his boots crunching in the dust. He strode forward with that same wolfish grin, revolver in hand. "You're a fool, Cole," he said. "You think a piece of paper makes 'em yours? You think that name'll save 'em?" Jedediah chambered another round, blood trickling from a gash on his temple where a bullet had grazed him. "No," he said, voice low, steady. "I do." The two men stood there, the world narrowing to just them, until Abel raised his pistol. The shot came not from Jedediah, but from behind him. Eli stood in the doorway, trembling, holding Jedediah's old sidearm with both hands. Smoke curled from the barrel. Abel staggered, eyes wide, a dark bloom spreading across his chest. The outlaws froze. Jedediah lowered his rifle just slightly, watching as Abel fell to his knees, then to the dirt. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, one by one, Clemens's men turned their horses and rode off into the night, leaving their leader in the dust. Silence settled heavy over the ranch. Jedediah turned slowly to face Eli, who was still gripping the pistol, his small hands shaking violently. "You did what you had to," Jedediah said softly, taking the gun from him. The boy's lip trembled. I didn't wanna." Jedediah crouched down, resting a hand on Eli's shoulder. "I know." Clara ran to them, throwing her arms around her brother. The three of them stayed there for a long moment, the night stretching quiet and endless around them. When the sun rose the next morning, Abel Clemens's body was gone. Whether his men came back for him or the coyotes took him, Jedediah never knew. But word spread. No one came for the twins after that. No one dared. Years later, folks in Red Bluff would still tell the story of Jed Cole, the quiet rancher who gave two orphans his last name and made it mean something worth bleeding for. Eli grew tall, strong, the kind of man who carried his father's steady silence. Clara became the heart of the ranch, the one who made strangers feel like they belonged. And Jedediah, who'd once thought his life was over, found himself sitting on that same porch many evenings, watching the two of them laugh in the fading light, realizing that somewhere along the way, the ranch had stopped feeling so empty. They were Cole now, his always